Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Call. Santos Mueller had always been a man who trusted his instincts. 20 years as a federal investigator for the Treasury Department had honed those instincts to razor sharpness. But nothing could have prepared him for the phone call that would shatter his world and rebuild it into something far more dangerous. The Denver International Airport grew smaller in his rearview mirror as he navigated the familiar route home. His wife, Lynette, sat beside him, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the passenger window. She was scrolling through photos on her phone from their weekend in San Francisco, occasionally showing him pictures of their visit to his sister's new gallery opening. "Look at this one of you and Marcella," Lynette laughed, holding up a shot of Santos with his arm around his sister. "You both have that same stubborn jaw when you're trying to look serious." Santos smiled, glancing at the photo. The weekend had been perfect, a rare break from the high-stakes financial crime cases that usually consumed his life. Lynette had been radiant at the gallery, charming everyone she met with her infectious enthusiasm for art and life. She was a pediatric nurse at Denver General, and her natural warmth drew people like a magnet. "Your sister's paintings are incredible," Lynette continued. "That landscape series could easily be in a major museum." "Don't let success go to her head," Santos replied, but his voice was warm with pride. The Mueller siblings had clawed their way up from nothing. Their father abandoned them when Santos was 12, leaving their mother to raise two kids on a waitress's salary. Santos had put himself through college and law enforcement training, while Marcella had fought for every art scholarship and gallery showing. They'd both learned early that in life, you either fought for what you wanted or watched others take it from you. His phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. The caller ID showed unknown number, which usually meant work. Santos almost let it go to voicemail. He wasn't officially back on duty until Monday, but something made him answer. "Santos Mueller." "Mr. Mueller? This is Jonathan Pearson with Air Traffic Control at Denver International. I'm calling about your wife's flight from San Francisco." Santos felt a chill run down his spine. "What about it?" "She's right here with me." There was a pause. "Sir, I need to inform you that Flight 447 from San Francisco experienced a serious incident. We've been trying to locate all passengers, and there's no record of the aircraft ever completing its landing sequence." Santos pulled over to the shoulder, his heart hammering. "That's impossible. I picked her up at baggage claimed 2 hours ago. She's sitting right next to me." Lynette looked up from her phone, concern creasing her features. "What's wrong?" "Sir," Pearson's voice was tight with something Santos recognized as fear. "What did you say?" "I said she's sitting right here in my car. We just left the airport. This is obviously some kind of mistake or system error." The line went quiet for several seconds. Santos could hear muffled voices in the background, then Pearson's voice again, but now he was speaking to someone else. "He says she's with him. In his car. Right now." More muffled conversation. Then Pearson came back on the line, his voice now urgent. "Mr. Mueller, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Stay in your vehicle. Lock the doors. Do not get out of the car under any circumstances." "What the hell is going on?" Santos demanded, but even as he said it, his investigator's mind was already processing the implications. Something was very wrong. "Sir, the woman who was in seat 14A on Flight 447, according to our records, she didn't survive the incident. We found her, the line cut to static, then went dead." Santos stared at his phone, then slowly turned to look at Lynette. She was watching him with those familiar green eyes, her expression puzzled but not alarmed. "Santos? Who was that? You look like you've seen a ghost." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Ghost." He studied her face, searching for something, anything, that seemed off. But it was Lynette, the tiny scar above her left eyebrow from falling off her bike at age 7, the way her nose crinkled when she was confused, the small birthmark on her neck. Every detail was exactly right. It was... Santos started, then stopped. His training kicked in. Gather information. Trust but verify. It was someone claiming to be from air traffic control. They said there was some kind of problem with your flight. That's weird. The flight was perfectly normal. We landed on time. Lynette reached over and touched his hand. Her fingers were warm, solid, real. You're shaking. What exactly did they say? Santos made a decision. Whatever was happening, he needed to control the situation. Probably just some mix-up with flight numbers. You know how these things go. He put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway, but his mind was racing. As a federal investigator, Santos had seen enough to know that when something seemed impossible, it usually meant you didn't have all the facts yet. People didn't just die in plane crashes and then show up sitting in cars. There had to be an explanation, mistaken identity, computer error, elaborate hoax, something. But as they drove toward their home in Cherry Creek, Santos found himself studying Lynette out of the corner of his eye. Everything about her seemed normal, but that phone call had injected a poison of doubt into his mind. He thought about the weekend in San Francisco, replaying every moment. Had there been anything strange? Any detail that didn't fit? Santos, you're making me nervous, Lynette said. You've got that look you get when you're working a case. Just thinking about work stuff, he lied smoothly. You know how it is. But that wasn't true. Santos was thinking about the fact that in 20 years of federal investigations, he'd learned that the most dangerous people were often the ones who seemed the most trustworthy. He'd put away embezzlers who were pillars of their communities, murderers who coached Little League, terrorists who taught Sunday school. The woman sitting next to him was either his wife of 8 years, or she was someone, or something else entirely. And until he figured out which, Santos Mueller wasn't taking any chances. As they pulled into their driveway, Santos's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it quickly, keeping his expression neutral. It was from a number he didn't recognize. The investigation begins now. Trust no one. A friend. Santos deleted the message and smiled at Lynette as they walked toward their front door. But his hand instinctively moved to check his concealed carry permit pistol under his jacket. Whatever game was being played, Santos Mueller intended to win. Chapter 2. Shadows of Doubt. The Mueller home in Cherry Creek had always been Santos's sanctuary, a place where the dark realities of financial crimes and federal investigations couldn't touch him. But as he watched Lynette move through their familiar routines that evening, every gesture felt like it was being performed under a microscope. She made dinner exactly the way she always did. Pasta with the homemade marinara sauce she'd learned from her Italian grandmother. A simple salad with a balsamic vinaigrette she mixed from scratch. She hummed while she cooked, the same Joni Mitchell song she always hummed. When she reached for the oregano on the top shelf, she had a stretch on her tiptoes just like always, and Santos automatically moved to help her, just like he had hundreds of times before. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. So tell me about this case you'll be working on when you get back, Lynette said as they sat down to eat. It was exactly the kind of question she always asked, interested in his work, but respectful of what he couldn't share. Complex financial fraud investigation, Santos replied, cutting his pasta. International wire transfers, shell companies. The usual boring stuff. It was a lie. Santos had actually requested to be transferred to a new case starting Monday. Something involving defense contractor fraud that would keep him in Denver for the foreseeable future. He'd made the request 6 months ago, not wanting to travel as much, wanting to spend more time with Lynette. But this woman wouldn't know that. Sounds fascinating, she said with a smile. Will you be traveling much? Santos paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. In 8 years of marriage, Lynette had never once described his financial fraud cases as fascinating. She was supportive, but she found the technical details mind-numbingly dull. She usually asked about travel to gauge how much time they'd have together, not out of interest in the work itself. Not much, he said carefully. Mostly local stuff. After dinner, Santos excused himself to his home office while Lynette settled in to watch a movie. He closed the door and immediately got to work, using his federal access to pull information about Flight 447. What he found made his blood run cold. Flight 447 from San Francisco to Denver had indeed experienced an incident, but the details were heavily classified, far beyond even his security clearance. The passenger manifest showed Lynette Mueller in seat 14A, but her status was listed as unconfirmed. Most disturbing of all, the flight had been diverted to a private airfield outside Colorado Springs, not Denver International. Santos dug deeper, using contacts and databases he probably shouldn't have been accessing. Jonathan Pearson was real. He did work air traffic control at Denver International. But there was no record of him making any calls that afternoon. In fact, Pearson had been off duty at his daughter's soccer game in Thornton. Someone had spoofed Pearson's identity to make that call. Someone wanted Santos to know about Flight 447, but they wanted it to seem like an accident, a routine notification. Santos's phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. Check the bedroom closet. Third shelf. Behind the winter coats. Santos stared at the message, his heart pounding. Someone was watching him, guiding him. But who? And why? He crept upstairs, pausing to listen. The TV was still playing downstairs, some romantic comedy Lynette loved. He could hear her laughing at all the right moments. In their bedroom closet, Santos pushed aside winter coats and found something that made him question his sanity, a small metal box he'd never seen before. Inside was a passport with Lynette's photo, but a different name, Rebecca May, and documentation showing she'd entered the country from Canada 3 days ago. His hands shook as he examined the documents. They were professionally done, not forgeries. The woman downstairs, the woman who cooked exactly like his wife, who knew intimate details of their life together, who even had the same scars and birthmarks. She wasn't Lynette Mueller. Santos heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly stuffed everything back where he'd found it. By the time the bedroom door opened, he was sitting on the bed, pretending to check work emails on his laptop. "Movie's over," she said, beginning to get ready for bed. "God, I'm exhausted. That flight took more out of me than I thought." Santos watched her carefully. "Anything unusual about the flight? Delays? Turbulence?" "Just normal flying stuff," she replied, pulling on her pajamas, the same blue cotton set Lynette always wore. "You know how much I hate flying. I spent most of it with my eyes closed." Another lie. Lynette was a nervous flyer, but she always dealt with anxiety by reading. She'd finished 3 novels on their flight to San Francisco, showing Santos the covers excitedly. A woman who spent the flight with her eyes closed wouldn't know about the normal flying stuff. As she brushed her teeth, Santos's mind raced through possibilities. The most rational explanation was that this was some kind of elaborate intelligence operation. Someone had kidnapped or killed his wife and replaced her with a near-perfect double. Someone who'd been briefed on Lynette's mannerisms, their relationship, their home. But why? Santos worked financial crimes, not national security. He wasn't involved in anything that would warrant this level of operation. Unless he'd stumbled onto something bigger than he realized in one of his cases. Something worth killing for. His phone buzzed again, tomorrow night. Cherry Creek State Park. Parking area C. Come alone. Answers await. Santos deleted the message and slipped into bed beside the woman who looked exactly like his wife. She curled up against him just like Lynette always did, her breathing settling into the familiar rhythm of sleep. But Santos lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, planning. Someone had taken his wife and sent him a replacement. They'd made one crucial mistake, though. They'd told him about it. The phone call from Jonathan Pearson was meant to plant seeds of doubt, to make him question reality. But why warn him at all? As dawn broke over Denver, Santos came to a chilling realization. This wasn't just about replacing Lynette. This was about manipulating him, controlling him. Someone needed Santos Mueller, federal investigator, to do something or stop doing something. And they were using the most precious thing in his world as leverage. Whatever they wanted, whoever they were, they'd picked the wrong man to manipulate. Santos Mueller had clawed his way up from nothing, survived a childhood of abandonment and poverty, built a career on bringing down people who thought they were untouchable. Now someone had declared war on him, using the oldest and cruelest weapon possible, taking away the person he loved most. But they'd made a critical error in judgment. They thought that by taking Lynette, they'd broken him. Instead, they'd just unleashed him. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Moon. Santos had always been methodical in his investigations, but the 24 hours following his discovery of the Rebecca made documents transformed him into something closer to a predator. He went through the motions of normal life, kissing the imposter goodbye before work, making small talk about dinner plans, while systematically hunting for the truth. At the federal building in downtown Denver, Santos uses access to dig deeper into Flight 447. What he found painted a picture so sinister it took his breath away. The flight hadn't crashed or been hijacked in any conventional sense. It had been intercepted by what appeared to be a private military operation, diverted to Blackwater Regional Airport, a facility owned by Dwayne Davidson, a defense contractor Santos had investigated 2 years earlier. Davidson. The name hit Santos like a physical blow. He'd built an airtight case against Davidson's company for fraudulent billing on military contracts, but the prosecution had collapsed when key witnesses suddenly recanted their testimony. Santos had always suspected intimidation, but could never prove it. Now Davidson owned the airfield where his wife's plane had been diverted. Santos pulled Davidson's file, refreshing his memory. Dwayne Davidson, 54, former Special Forces turned defense contractor. His company, Apex Security Solutions, provided private military services to governments and corporations worldwide. On paper, Davidson was worth about $50 million. In reality, Santos suspected his wealth and influence ran much deeper. The man was connected to politicians, intelligence agencies, and foreign governments. He was exactly the kind of person who could orchestrate the kidnapping of federal agents' wives and replace them with trained operatives. But why target Santos? The Davidson investigation was closed, the case dead. Unless Santos spent his lunch break in the archives, pulling every file related to the Davidson case. Buried in witness statements and financial records, he found what he was looking for, a pattern of payments from Davidson's accounts to a series of shell companies. The amounts were small, spread over months, designed to avoid triggering banking regulations. Santos had flagged these transactions in his original investigation, but hadn't been able to trace where the money went. Now, with fresh eyes and new desperation, he began connecting dots. The shell companies led to other companies, which led to real estate purchases, which led to... Fuck, Santos breathed, staring at his computer screen. The money trail ended at a network of facilities across the western United States, training facilities, safe houses, and what looked like private detention centers. Davidson hadn't just been stealing from the military. He'd been building his own shadow intelligence operation. And now Santos knew too much. His phone rang. Mueller. Santos, it's Edwin Piper. His supervisor's voice was tight. I need to see you in my office. Now. Santos's blood chilled. Edwin Piper had been his mentor for 15 years, the man who'd sponsored Santos's rise through the federal ranks. If Piper was involved in this... On my way, Santos said. Piper's office overlooked the Denver Federal Center, its walls lined with commendations and photos from 3 decades of law enforcement. When Santos entered, he found Piper standing by the window, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by something much darker. Close the door, Santos. Santos complied, his hand instinctively checking his weapon. I'm going to ask you a question, Piper said without turning around, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. Have you been conducting unauthorized research into the Davidson case? The question confirmed Santos's worst fears. Either Piper was working with Davidson, or Davidson had people monitoring federal databases. Either way, Santos was blown. Ed, I think my wife might be in danger. Someone's been. Your wife is fine, Santos. Piper turned around, and Santos saw something in his mentor's eyes he'd never seen before. Fear. She's at home, making dinner, completely safe. But that safety depends on you following orders. Santos felt the world shift beneath his feet. You son of a bitch. You're working with him. I'm trying to keep you alive, Piper snapped. Davidson isn't just some defense contractor, Santos. He's connected to intelligence operations that go way above both our pay grades. You stumbled onto something in that investigation that you weren't supposed to see. So you let him walk? I let him walk so that dedicated federal agents like you could keep doing their jobs without disappearing into unmarked graves in the desert. Piper moved to his desk, pulling out a thick file. Davidson offered you a choice. Stop digging, forget what you found, and your wife stays safe. Keep investigating and what? You'll kill her. They already have killed her, Santos. The words hit like a sledgehammer. The woman in your house isn't Lynette. Lynette died when Flight 447 was intercepted. That woman is Rebecca May, a Canadian intelligence operative trained to be your wife. She's there to monitor you, to make sure you don't become a problem. Santos's vision blurred with rage. Where is she? Where's Lynette's body? I don't know. And if you're smart, you'll stop asking. Take early retirement. Move away. Start over with your new wife. She's been programmed to love you just as much as Lynette did. Live your life, Santos. It's the only way you get to keep living it. Santos stared at his mentor, the man who'd taught him everything about federal investigation, about justice, about never backing down from the truth. You're a coward, Ed. I'm a survivor, and I'm trying to help you survive too. Santos turned and walked toward the door, then stopped. The meeting tonight at Cherry Creek State Park. That's your doing? Piper nodded reluctantly. Davidson wants to meet you face to face, to make his offer directly. Then tell Davidson I'll be there. But tell him something else too. Santos looked back at his mentor with cold fury. Tell him Santos Mueller doesn't negotiate with terrorists. And tell him that killing my wife was the biggest mistake he ever made. Santos left the federal building knowing he couldn't go back. By accessing the Davidson files, by pushing too hard, he'd signed his own death warrant. But he'd also learned something crucial. Davidson was afraid of him. Afraid enough to kill Lynette. Afraid enough to replace her with an operative. Afraid enough to want a face-to-face meeting. That fear was Santos's only weapon, and he intended to use it. As he drove toward Cherry Creek State Park that evening, Santos thought about Lynette. Not the woman making dinner in his kitchen, but his real wife. The woman who'd held him when his mother died. The woman who'd celebrated with him when he made federal agent. The woman who'd never asked him to be anything other than himself. They'd taken her from him, but they'd also given him a purpose that burned brighter than any case he'd ever worked. Dwayne Davidson thought he could control Santos Mueller through fear and manipulation. Tonight, Davidson was about to learn that some men became more dangerous, not less, when they had nothing left to lose. Chapter 4. The Devil's Bargain. Cherry Creek State Park after dark was a maze of shadows and whispered promises. Santos arrived at Parking Area C an hour early, using the time to survey the terrain with the tactical mindset he'd learned from his federal training. The location was well chosen, remote enough for privacy, but public enough that a disappearance would raise questions. Davidson's people were professionals. Santos spotted at least 3 surveillance positions around the parking area, 2 escape routes that had been secured, and what looked like signal jammers to prevent any electronic recording. They prepared for this meeting like a military operation. At exactly 9 p.m., a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the lot. Santos remained in his own vehicle, watching as 4 men emerged. 3 were clearly security, military bearing, concealed weapons, coordinated movement. The 4th was Dwayne Davidson himself. Santos had studied Davidson's file extensively, but seeing him in person was different. The man radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having to face real consequences. He was tall, silver-haired, expensively dressed despite the outdoor setting. But his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd long ago stopped seeing other people as human beings. Davidson walked alone towards Santos's car, leaving his security team positioned around the perimeter. The message was clear. I'm not afraid of you, but I'm not stupid either. Santos rolled down his window as Davidson approached. Mr. Mueller, thank you for coming. Cut the bullshit, Davidson. Where's my wife's body? Davidson smiled, an expression devoid of warmth. Your wife died quickly, Mr. Mueller. She never knew what was happening. That's more mercy than he usually show federal investigators who threaten my operations. The casual admission of murder hit Santos like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. What do you want? I want you to understand your situation, and I want to offer you a way forward that keeps everyone alive who's still breathing. Davidson gestured toward the park's picnic area. Walk with me. Your recording devices won't work anyway. We're jamming everything electronic within a half-mile radius. Santos got out of his car, noting the positions of Davidson's security team. 3 men with professional military training, armed, coordinated. Not impossible odds, but close to it. They walked toward a picnic table overlooking the reservoir. The Denver city lights twinkled in the distance like fallen stars. "Beautiful view," Davidson said conversationally. "Do you know what I see when I look at those lights? I see 800,000 people going about their lives, completely unaware that their safety depends on men like me. Men willing to do what others won't. Men willing to murder innocent people. Your wife wasn't innocent, Mr. Mueller. The moment she married a federal investigator, she became a potential weapon against me. When you started digging into my operations again, she became an active threat." Santos's hands clenched into fists. "I wasn't investigating you. The case was closed. But you were planning to reopen it, weren't you? My sources in the federal system indicated you'd been requesting resources for a new investigation. Something about following money trails you'd missed the first time." Santos went cold. He had been planning exactly that. Not actively investigating, just thinking about how he might approach the case differently if given another chance. But those thoughts had been private, shared with no one. "How could you possibly know that?" Davidson smiled again. "Rebecca May is a very talented operative, Mr. Mueller. She's been reporting on your conversations, your plans, your dreams, your fears. Did you really think we'd place someone in your home without ensuring she could do her job?" The violation was complete. Not only had they killed Lynette and replaced her with an imposter, but they'd been using that imposter to monitor his most private thoughts and feelings. "Here's what's going to happen," Davidson continued. "You're going to go home to your wife. You're going to put in for early retirement, medical reasons, stress, whatever. You're going to move somewhere far away from Denver and start a new life. Rebecca will go with you, play the devoted wife, give you children if you want them. She's been programmed to love you genuinely, Mr. Mueller. It won't be an act. And if I refuse, then Rebecca will have a tragic accident. Car crash, perhaps, or a home invasion gone wrong. And then we'll replace her with someone else. And if that person has an accident, we'll find another replacement. We have an extensive roster of operatives, Mr. Mueller. The question is, how many women are you willing to watch die before you accept that resistance is futile?" Santos studied Davidson's face in the moonlight. The man wasn't bluffing. He had the resources, the connections, and the complete moral bankruptcy to carry out his threats indefinitely. "Why not just kill me? Because you're useful to me alive. A federal investigator who knows to stay away from my operations is an asset. Someone who might warn other agents away from cases they shouldn't pursue. You could have a very comfortable retirement, Mr. Mueller, and a very happy marriage to a woman designed to be perfect for you." Davidson pulled out a satellite phone and showed Santos a photo. It was Lynette's body, recognizable despite the obvious signs of violence. "This is what defiance costs. This is what your real wife paid for your stubborn sense of justice." The image seared into Santos's memory, but also crystallized his resolve. Looking at what they'd done to Lynette, Santos made a choice that would have surprised his enemies. He decided to lie. "Okay," he said quietly. "You win. I'll put in for early retirement next week." Davidson studied him carefully. Just like that. Just like that. "You made your point. I don't want Rebecca to end up like Lynette. I'll play along." For the first time, Davidson looked genuinely pleased. "I knew you were a smart man, Mr. Mueller. Most people take much longer to see reason." "I'm not most people." "No, you're not. That's why this arrangement will work so well." Davidson pocketed the satellite phone. "Rebecca will be monitoring your compliance, of course. Any signs of continued investigation, any contacts with other federal agents about this matter, any attempts to go public with what you've learned, and she'll report it immediately." "Understood." "Good. Then we have an agreement." They shook hands, Davidson's grip firm and confident, Santos's conveying the resignation of a beaten man. But inside, Santos was already planning. Davidson had made several critical errors in his moment of triumph. First, he confirmed that Rebecca May was monitoring and reporting everything. That meant Santos could feed her false information, control what Davidson knew about his activities. Second, Davidson had admitted to maintaining extensive files and operations. A network that large had vulnerabilities, pressure points, ways to be attacked and dismantled. Third, and most important, Davidson had shown Santos the photograph of Lynette's body. In doing so, he'd revealed the location where she'd been killed. Santos recognized the industrial setting in the background. It was one of Davidson's facilities, probably the one outside Colorado Springs. As they walked back toward their vehicles, Santos played his role perfectly. He looked defeated, resigned, broken. He thanked Davidson for his mercy and promised to begin retirement paperwork immediately. Davidson's security team relaxed as their boss shook hands with the apparently neutered federal agent. They saw a man who'd been successfully intimidated, a threat that had been neutralized. They didn't see what Santos Mueller had become in that moment by the reservoir, staring at the photo of his murdered wife. They didn't recognize the cold, calculating fury that now burned in his eyes. They had no idea that they'd just awakened something far more dangerous than a federal investigator. They'd awakened a husband with nothing left to lose and 20 years of training in how to destroy people who thought they were untouchable. As Santos drove home to the woman who wasn't his wife, he began planning Dwayne Davidson's complete destruction. It would be methodical, thorough, and absolutely merciless. The game had changed, and Santos Mueller intended to win. Chapter 5, The Perfect Wife. Santos returned home to find Rebecca May preparing late-night tea, exactly as Lynette used to do when he worked evening cases. She looked up with practiced concern as he entered the kitchen, her performance flawless down to the smallest detail. "How'd it go? You were gone longer than usual." "Just had to meet with a witness about an old case," Santos lied smoothly, accepting the mug she handed him. Earl Grey with a teaspoon of honey, exactly how he liked it. Nothing important. Over the following weeks, Santos played his role as perfectly as Rebecca played hers. He submitted paperwork for early medical retirement, citing stress and burnout. He made appointments with real estate agents to discuss selling their house. He even began researching small towns where they might relocate, places with good hospitals where a pediatric nurse might find work. All of it was theater performed for an audience of one. But while Rebecca reported his compliance to her handlers, Santos was conducting the most important investigation of his career. He used every skill he'd learned in 20 years of federal service, every contact he'd cultivated, every favor he was owed. The key breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Marcella, his sister. "You seem different," she said during one of their weekly phone calls. "Distant, like you're performing instead of living." Santos was careful with his words, knowing Rebecca was likely listening. "Just thinking about the future. Big changes coming. Well, I have some news that might interest you. Remember that art collector from San Francisco who bought 3 of my paintings? Kyle Christian." Santos nearly dropped the phone. Kyle Christian had been one of the names in Davidson's financial records, a shell identity used to purchase real estate in Nevada. "What about him?" "He called about commissioning a large piece for his private retreat in Colorado, some place called the Apex Center. He wants landscape paintings that match the local terrain exactly. Very specific requirements." The Apex Center. Santos had found references to it in Davidson's files, but couldn't locate it. Now he had a way in. "That's wonderful, Marcella. Sounds like a major commission." "It is, but Santos, something feels off about this guy. He knew too much about me, about our family. Asked weird questions about you during our conversations." Santos felt ice in his veins. Davidson was using Marcella to monitor him, just as he was using Rebecca. His sister was being drawn into this web of surveillance and danger. "I think you should pass on that commission," Santos said carefully. "Why?" "The money is excellent, and just trust me on this one." That night, after Rebecca had fallen asleep, Santos made a decision that would have horrified Davidson if he'd known about it. Santos had been thinking like a federal investigator, trying to build a case against Davidson through evidence and procedure. But Davidson existed beyond the reach of normal justice. He had politicians in his pocket, federal agents on his payroll, and enough resources to make problems disappear permanently. So Santos decided to stop thinking like a federal investigator and start thinking like Davidson himself. Ruthlessly, without regard for rules or consequences, focused solely on results. His first move was to establish a secure communications channel. Santos drove to an electronics store in a part of Denver he never normally visited, paying cash for a prepaid phone and laptop. He used public Wi-Fi from a coffee shop to reach out to contacts Davidson couldn't monitor. Former military personnel who'd worked private security, freelance investigators who operated in gray legal areas, and one particular individual Santos had arrested 5 years earlier, but who owed him a favor. Willie Herman had been a mid-level intelligence operative who'd gotten caught selling classified information to foreign bidders. Santos's investigation had revealed that Herman was actually a double agent, feeding false information to America's enemies while gathering intelligence on their operations. Instead of prosecuting Herman, Santos had quietly recommended him for witness protection and a clean slate. Now Santos needed Herman's particular set of skills. They met at a truck stop outside Colorado Springs, both men taking extensive precautions to avoid surveillance. Herman looked older, weathered by 5 years of living under an assumed identity, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him valuable to 3 different intelligence agencies. Santos Mueller, Herman said with a wry smile. Well, I got your message. I figured you were either in deep trouble or planning something incredibly stupid. Both, probably. Santos laid out the situation, holding nothing back. Herman listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. Dwayne Davidson, Herman said finally. Yeah, I know that name. He's been recruiting ex-intelligence operatives for years, building some kind of private network. Word in certain circles is that he's got clients in foreign governments, multinational corporations, even some 3-letter agencies that want deniable assets. Can his operation be infiltrated? Maybe, but not through conventional means. Davidson's paranoid as hell, runs everything through cutouts and compartmentalized cells. Even his own people don't know the full scope of what he's doing. Herman studied Santos carefully. What exactly are you planning here? I'm going to destroy him. Completely. I'm going to dismantle his organization, expose his operations, and make sure he pays for what he did to Lynette. And the woman in your house. Santos felt something cold settle in his chest. Rebecca May is an enemy operative who's been violating my privacy and reporting on my activities for weeks. When this is over, she'll face the consequences of her choices. Herman nodded slowly. All right, but if we're going to do this, we do it right. No half measures, no federal procedure, no rules of evidence. We do whatever it takes to win, and we don't look back. Agreed. Then let's start with what you know about Davidson's facilities. Because if we're going to bring down his operation, we need to hit him where it hurts most. Over the next 3 hours, Santos and Herman planned what amounted to a private war against Dwayne Davidson. They identified targets, secured resources, and established protocols that would make Santos's actions completely deniable. By the time they parted ways, Santos had transformed from a federal investigator seeking justice into something far more dangerous. A man with the skills to wage asymmetric warfare and nothing left to lose. As Santos drove home that night, he thought about the woman waiting in his bed. Rebecca May had probably been briefed on his psychological profile, told that he was a by-the-books federal agent who would eventually accept his situation and adapt to it. She'd been trained to be the perfect replacement for Lynette, programmed to make him love her. But Rebecca and her handlers had made a crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that taking Lynette away would break Santos's will to fight. Instead, it had removed the last moral constraints that had kept him operating within the bounds of law and procedure. Santos Mueller, the federal investigator, would have tried to build a case against Davidson and bring him to justice through the courts. Santos Mueller, the widower, had different plans entirely. As he slipped quietly into bed beside Rebecca, Santos smiled in the darkness. Let her report his compliance to Davidson. Let them think they'd won. The deeper their complacency, the more devastating their fall would be. The war was about to begin, and Santos held all the advantages: superior knowledge of his enemy, access to resources Davidson couldn't monitor, and the absolute certainty that comes from having nothing left to lose. Davidson had made one final, fatal error. By showing Santos that photograph of Lynette's body, he'd proven that this wasn't about national security or legitimate intelligence operations. This was about a sociopathic criminal who killed innocent people to protect his power and wealth. And Santos Mueller had spent 20 years of his life learning exactly how to destroy people like that. Chapter 6. The Network Unravels. 3 weeks into his campaign against Davidson, Santos had learned to live 2 lives simultaneously. By day, he played the role of a defeated federal agent preparing for retirement. He showed Rebecca house listings in quiet mountain towns, discussed plans for a simpler life, even bought her flowers and took her to dinner like a devoted husband adapting to their new reality. By night, he waged a sophisticated intelligence war that would have impressed his former colleagues at the Treasury Department. The first phase had been reconnaissance. Using Willie Herman's contacts and his own investigative skills, Santos had mapped Davidson's network with surgical precision. The Apex Center wasn't just a private retreat. It was the hub of Davidson's intelligence operation, housing training facilities, communication centers, and what appeared to be holding cells for uncooperative targets. The second phase was disruption. Santos began with financial warfare, the specialty he'd honed in 20 years of federal service. Using techniques that existed in legal gray areas, he systematically attacked Davidson's funding streams. Shell companies found their account frozen due to suspicious activity reports. Government contracts faced sudden regulatory reviews. International wire transfers were delayed or misdirected through computer glitches. None of these actions could be traced back to Santos, but their cumulative effect was devastating. Davidson's operation was built on careful financial planning and predictable cash flow. Santos turned that strength into a weakness. The third phase was psychological warfare. Mr. Mueller? Rebecca looked up from her laptop one evening, concern creasing her features. I just got the strangest phone call. Someone claiming to be from the Canadian consulate, asking about my immigration status. Santos looked appropriately puzzled. That is strange. Did they say what it was about? They mentioned some discrepancy in my documentation. I told them I was born in Toronto, but they said their records showed no birth certificate for Rebecca May on the date I gave them. Santos had arranged the call, of course, using Herman's contacts to have someone pose as a consular official. The goal wasn't to expose Rebecca immediately. That would alert Davidson and ruin everything. The goal was to make Rebecca question her own cover story, to introduce doubt and stress that would affect her performance. Bureaucratic mix-up, probably, Santos said. You know how government systems can be. But he could see the seed of doubt in Rebecca's eyes. Professional operatives were trained to maintain cover under pressure, but they were also trained to recognize when that cover might be compromised. Rebecca was beginning to wonder if someone was investigating her background. That doubt would make her more cautious, more likely to second-guess her reports to Davidson. It would also make her handlers more suspicious of the intelligence she provided, reducing their confidence in their surveillance of Santos. The fourth phase was direct action. Santos had identified 17 facilities connected to Davidson's network across 4 western states. Most were lightly defended, used primarily for training and administrative functions. But 3 sites appeared to be high-value targets: the Apex Center in Colorado, a communications facility in Utah, and what looked like a detention center in Nevada. The Nevada facility was where Santos believed they'd taken Lynette before killing her. Working with Herman and a carefully selected team of former military contractors, Santos began systematic raids on Davidson's secondary facilities. They used techniques borrowed from special forces operations: fast insertion, data extraction, facility destruction, clean withdrawal. The first facility they hit was a training camp disguised as a corporate retreat center outside Moab, Utah. Santos and his team breached the perimeter at 2 a.m., neutralized security systems, and extracted hard drives and documents before setting fire to the buildings. The whole operation took 23 minutes. The intelligence they gathered was gold: training manuals for surveillance operatives, psychological profiles of federal agents targeted for monitoring, and most importantly, a roster of current operations. Santos's hands shook as he read through the files. Davidson had been conducting illegal surveillance on hundreds of federal agents, judges, prosecutors, and politicians. The scope of the operation was staggering. A private intelligence network that treated the United States government as a hostile entity to be monitored and controlled. But what made Santos's blood run cold was finding Lynette's file. It contained detailed psychological assessments, surveillance photos taken without her knowledge, and plans for her termination that dated back 6 months before Flight 447. They hadn't killed Lynette as a response to Santos's investigation. They'd been planning to kill her from the beginning, as part of a long-term operation to control him. The revelation transformed Santos's careful anger into something much more dangerous. Pure rage focused with surgical precision. The second facility they hit was a communication center in rural Wyoming. This time, Santos didn't just extract intelligence. He turned the facility against Davidson's own network. Herman planted sophisticated malware that would give them access to Davidson's communications while remaining undetectable. Now Santos could read Davidson's messages in real time, tracking his responses to the attacks, his attempt to identify the source of his problems, his growing paranoia as his carefully controlled operation began falling apart. What Santos learned was that Davidson was indeed reporting to higher authorities, not just government agencies, but international clients who paid enormous sums for intelligence on American political and business leaders. Davidson wasn't just a rogue contractor. He was essentially a private spy service selling American secrets to the highest bidder. The third facility was personal. The detention center in Nevada was built like a black site prison, hidden in desert terrain with no official existence. Santos and his team surveilled it for 3 days before moving, mapping patrol routes, identifying weaknesses, planning an operation that would be both strategically valuable and personally satisfying. The raid began at dawn. Santos led the assault personally, using breaching charges and flashbang grenades to overwhelm the defenders. The facility held 12 prisoners, federal agents, prosecutors, and journalists who'd apparently gotten too close to Davidson's operations. But Santos's primary objective was the basement level, where Herman's intelligence suggested Davidson kept records of terminated targets. What Santos found in that basement changed everything. Lynette wasn't Davidson's first victim. The files documented dozens of murders going back years, federal agents who'd died in accidents, prosecutors who'd succumbed to heart attacks, journalists who'd perished in muggings gone wrong. Davidson had been assassinating American officials for years, eliminating anyone who threatened his operation or his client's interests. And there, in a refrigerated storage unit, Santos found what remained of his wife. The drive back to Denver was the longest of Santos's life. Lynette's body was finally coming home, but her murderer was still free, still operating, still killing innocent people to protect his criminal empire. Rebecca was waiting when Santos returned home, her expression concerned. "You were gone all day. I tried calling, but your phone went straight to voicemail." "Just had to drive up to Cheyenne for some retirement paperwork," Santos lied, smoothly. Boring government stuff. But Rebecca was studying him more carefully now, her training making her sensitive to changes in his behavior. She could sense something different about him, some fundamental shift that her psychological profile of Santos Mueller hadn't predicted. "Santos, are you feeling all right? You seem different lately." Santos looked at the woman who'd been living in his home for weeks, monitoring his every word and action, reporting his most private moments to the man who'd murdered his wife. Rebecca May, who'd been programmed to love him, who'd been trained to replace Lynette so perfectly that he might never notice the difference. "I feel fine," Santos said, walking past her toward his study. "Better than I have in months, actually." And it was true. For the first time since this nightmare began, Santos had a clear picture of his enemy and a concrete plan for victory. Davidson's network was crumbling under sustained attack. His finances were in chaos. His operations were compromised. But most importantly, Santos now had everything he needed to spring the trap he'd been preparing for weeks. Tomorrow night, Dwayne Davidson would learn what happened to men who declared war on Santos Mueller. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Chapter 7. The Devil's Due. The text message arrived at 6 p.m., exactly as Santos had planned. Location compromised. Emergency extraction required. Cherry Creek Park, midnight. Come alone. Rebecca showed him the message, her face a mask of professional concern. What do you think this means? Santos studied the phone, playing his role perfectly. I have no idea. Maybe someone's threatening one of your old cases. It was a masterful performance of confused innocence. Rebecca would report the message to her handlers, who would assume it was legitimate communication from one of their other operations. They'd never suspect that Santos had sent it himself, using communication protocols he'd extracted from Davidson's compromised facilities. Should we call the police? Rebecca asked. Let me think about it. Maybe I should go meet with whoever sent this, find out what's happening. That could be dangerous. Santos appreciated the irony. Rebecca May, the woman sent to monitor and manipulate him, was now expressing genuine concern for his safety. Her psychological conditioning was so complete that she probably believed her own feelings. I'll be careful, Santos promised. Besides, what else can I do? If someone's in trouble and they reached out to me, I can't just ignore it. Rebecca nodded reluctantly, as Santos had known she would. Her profile of his character emphasized his sense of duty and his inability to abandon people who needed help. She would report this to Davidson as expected behavior. What she wouldn't report was Santos's true destination. At 11 p.m., Santos kissed Rebecca goodbye and drove toward Cherry Creek State Park. But instead of going to the meeting location, he took a circuitous route to his real objective, the Apex Center, Davidson's primary facility hidden in the foothills outside Colorado Springs. Willie Herman and his team were already in position, having spent 3 days infiltrating the facility's security systems. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. While Davidson's people were preparing for a fake emergency meeting at Cherry Creek, Santos would penetrate their headquarters and extract the intelligence that would destroy their entire organization. But Santos had a secondary objective that Herman didn't know about. Hidden in the Apex Center's files was evidence that could bring down not just Davidson, but the entire network of corrupt officials who'd enabled his operation. Politicians, intelligence officers, federal prosecutors, everyone who turned a blind eye to Davidson's crimes in exchange for money or favors. Santos wanted them all. The Apex Center was built into a natural depression in the foothills, camouflaged to look like a corporate retreat from aerial surveillance. But Herman's reconnaissance had revealed the truth. It was a fortress, complete with underground bunkers, sophisticated security systems, and enough firepower to repel a small army. Santos infiltrated the facility through a service tunnel Herman had identified, emerging into a basement level that housed the center's communication and data processing systems. The building's layout matched the intelligence they'd gathered from capture documents, 12 levels above ground, 5 levels below, with Davidson's personal offices and the most sensitive files located on the top floor. The war was no longer covert. Santos drove home through empty Denver streets, his phone buzzing with encrypted messages from Willie Herman. The coordinated strikes on Davidson's remaining facilities had been devastating. For more installations destroyed, 3 captured, and dozens of operatives either killed or taken prisoner. Davidson's network was crumbling in real time. But Santos's most valuable prize wasn't the physical damage. It was the intelligence he'd extracted from Davidson's computers before destroying the Apex Center. The files contain enough evidence to bring down not just Davidson, but 37 federal officials who'd been collaborating with his operation, including Edwin Piper. When Santos arrived home, he found Rebecca waiting in the living room, still fully dressed despite the late hour. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Santos could see the tension in her posture. "How did your meeting go?" she asked. "Strange. Nobody showed up. I waited for an hour, then came home." Santos moved toward the kitchen, playing the role of confused innocence. Maybe it was a prank or something. Rebecca nodded, but Santos caught her glancing toward her phone. She was probably receiving updates about the destruction of Davidson's facilities, trying to reconcile Santos's apparent ignorance with the catastrophic damage being done to her organization. "I'm exhausted," Santos said, kissing her forehead. "Let's go to bed." In their bedroom, Rebecca went through her normal routine, changing into pajamas, brushing her teeth, setting her phone on the nightstand. But Santos noticed she was taking longer than usual, probably receiving detailed instructions from her handlers about how to proceed. Santos pretended to fall asleep quickly, but he remained alert, listening to Rebecca's breathing, monitoring her movements. Around 3 a.m., she carefully got out of bed and retrieved her phone, probably to send a status report. It was time to end the charade. "Rebecca," Santos said quietly, not turning over or opening his eyes. "Before you send that message, you might want to know that your entire organization just ceased to exist." He felt her freeze beside the bed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The Apex Center burned to the ground 3 hours ago, along with your training facilities in Utah, Wyoming, Nevada, and California. Your communication networks have been compromised. Your financial assets have been frozen. And most importantly, every federal official who was collaborating with Davidson is about to be arrested on charges of treason." Santos rolled over and looked at her in the dim light from the street. Rebecca's professional mask had finally slipped, revealing the trapped animal underneath. "Your real name is Rebecca May," Santos continued conversationally. "You're a Canadian intelligence operative who was recruited by Davidson's organization 18 months ago. You've been living as my wife for 6 weeks, monitoring my activities and reporting to Dwayne Davidson. You participated in the murder of Lynette Mueller, an innocent woman whose only crime was marrying a federal investigator." Rebecca's hand moved toward the nightstand, where Santos knew she kept a concealed weapon. But Santos was faster, his own pistol appearing in his hand with practiced ease. "I wouldn't," he advised. "You're already in enough trouble." Rebecca sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, her hands visible. "What do you want?" "I want you to make a choice. You can face trial for espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 30 other federal charges that will put you away for life. Or you can cooperate with federal prosecutors and testify against Davidson and everyone who worked with him. And if I cooperate, witness protection, new identity, a chance to start over somewhere far away from this mess." Rebecca studied Santos's face in the darkness. "Why are you offering me this?" "I helped kill your wife." The question hit Santos like a physical blow, but he'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. "Because you were following orders from people who manipulated you. Because Lynette would have wanted me to show mercy when I could. And because I need your testimony to make sure everyone responsible for this pays the price." It was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Santos had spent 6 weeks watching Rebecca play the role of perfect wife, and despite knowing what she was, he'd been impressed by her intelligence, her dedication, even her genuine moments of seeming to care about him. She was a victim of Davidson's manipulation too, programmed to believe in a mission that was actually a criminal enterprise. "Davidson will kill me if I testify," Rebecca said. "Davidson will be dead or in federal prison within 48 hours, Santos replied. "I have enough evidence to destroy him and everyone who worked with him. The only question is whether you want to go down with him or help me make sure justice is served." Rebecca was quiet for several minutes, processing her options. Finally, she looked up at Santos with something like respect in her eyes. "You played us all, didn't you? From the very beginning. From the moment I received that phone call about Flight 447. I knew something was wrong, so I started investigating. What I found was bigger than I imagined. A criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. And you destroyed it all." "Not yet, but I will." Rebecca stood up slowly, her hands still visible. "If I cooperate, if I testify against Davidson and the others, will you tell the prosecutors that I try to protect you at the end? That I wasn't completely evil?" Santos studied her face, looking for deception, but finding only resignation and perhaps a glimmer of hope. "If you tell the truth about everything, about Davidson's operations, about the other federal agents being monitored, about who gave the orders to kill Lynette, then yes. I'll make sure they know you chose to do the right thing when it mattered. Then I'll cooperate. Santos nodded and picked up his phone. Willie Herman? It's time. Have your FBI contacts meet us at the Denver Federal Building in 1 hour. And tell them to bring arrest warrants for everyone on the list I sent you. As Santos got dressed, he thought about Lynette and what she would have said about his campaign against Davidson. She'd always believed in justice tempered with mercy, in fighting evil without becoming evil yourself. She would have approved of offering Rebecca a chance at redemption. But she also would have insisted that everyone responsible for her death face the full consequences of their actions. As dawn broke over Denver, Santos Mueller prepared to walk into the federal building one last time. Not as a defeated investigator seeking early retirement, but as the man who'd single-handedly exposed and destroyed the largest domestic espionage operation in American history. Dwayne Davidson's empire was about to fall, and Santos intended to be there when it happened. Justice for Lynette was finally at hand. Moving through the facility required every stealth skill Santos had learned in 20 years of federal service. Davidson's security team was military-trained and heavily armed, but they were expecting threats from outside the facility, not from someone who'd already penetrated their perimeter. Santos made his way upward through maintenance corridors and service elevators, avoiding patrol routes Herman had mapped during their surveillance. The plan called for him to reach Davidson's office, extract financial records and client lists, and escape before anyone realized the facility had been breached. But when Santos reached the 10th floor, he found something that changed everything. The level had been converted into a private apartment, complete with luxury furnishings, a full kitchen, and what appeared to be living quarters for a permanent resident. But it wasn't Davidson's apartment. The personal belongings suggested someone else lived here. Santos found his answer in a photograph on the bedside table. Edwin Piper, his former supervisor, shaking hands with Davidson at what looked like a government function. Piper wasn't just working with Davidson. He was living at the Apex Center, serving as Davidson's primary liaison with federal law enforcement. Santos's mentor, the man who'd guided his career for 15 years, was the inside source who'd made Davidson's operation possible. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Piper had recommended Santos for cases that would benefit Davidson's clients. He'd steered investigations away from Davidson's operations. He'd probably even suggested Santos as a target for surveillance and manipulation. Santos found Piper's files in a secure cabinet beside his bed. The documents revealed years of collaboration with Davidson, including detailed plans for monitoring and controlling federal agents across multiple agencies. Santos wasn't Davidson's only target. He was just one of dozens of federal officials being manipulated through threats, blackmail, and replacement of family members. But the most damning document was a communication log showing that Piper had been reporting Santos's activities to Davidson from the very beginning of their relationship. Every case Santos had worked, every success he'd achieved, every trust he'd placed in his mentor, all of it had been monitored and reported to a criminal who was selling American secrets to foreign governments. Santos photographed everything with his phone, his hands shaking with rage. Piper's betrayal was worse than Davidson's crimes because it was personal. Davidson was a sociopathic criminal who'd chosen evil for profit. Piper was a man Santos had trusted, admired, and loved like a father. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped Santos back to operational reality. He quickly secured the files and moved toward the emergency exit, but the footsteps were coming from that direction. Santos was trapped on the 10th floor with nowhere to go but up. He made his way to the stairwell and climbed toward Davidson's office on the 12th floor. If he was going to be discovered, he might as well complete his mission first. Davidson's office was a monument to ego and paranoia. The walls were covered with photographs of Davidson meeting with politicians, military officers, and foreign dignitaries. A gun safe stood open, revealing enough firepower to equip a small military unit. And dominating the room was a massive desk covered with documents related to operations across 3 continents. Santos began photographing everything, his phone's camera capturing page after page of incriminating evidence. Client lists, operational plans, financial records, assassination orders. It was all there enough evidence to destroy Davidson's network and expose every official who'd enabled his crimes. Then Santos found a file that made him stop breathing. It was labeled Operation Nightshade, and it detailed Davidson's plan to systematically eliminate federal agents who posed threats to his operations. The list included prosecutors, investigators, and judges from across the country. Santos's name was third on the list, with a note indicating that his termination should appear to be a murder-suicide involving his wife. They'd planned to kill both Santos and Lynette, then claimed Santos had snapped under job stress and killed his wife before turning the gun on himself. It would have been the perfect cover for eliminating a troublesome federal agent while sending a message to others who might consider investigating Davidson's operations. The only reason Santos was still alive was that Davidson had decided his intelligence value was greater than the threat he posed. But that calculation could change at any moment. Santos pocketed the Operation Nightshade file and prepared to leave, but the sound of elevator doors opening on the floor below told him it was too late. Davidson's security team had discovered the breach and was conducting a systematic search of the building. Santos had minutes, maybe less, before they reached the 12th floor. He moved to Davidson's computer and inserted a USB drive Herman had prepared, uploading malware that would give them remote access to Davidson's entire network. While the virus installed, Santos used Davidson's satellite phone to send a pre-written message to Willie Herman, package secure. Initiate final phase. The message would trigger Herman's team to begin the coordinated assault on Davidson's remaining facilities, using the intelligence Santos had gathered to strike at every vulnerable point simultaneously. As footsteps echoed in the stairwell, Santos moved to the office's balcony and looked down at the 12-story drop to the parking lot below. There was no escape route. Davidson's security team had sealed the building. But Santos Mueller had faced impossible odds before, and he'd always found a way to win. He activated the building's fire suppression system using Davidson's computer, triggering alarms that would force the security team to evacuate the lower floors. In the confusion, Santos made his way back down to the basement level, where Herman's prepositioned charges were waiting to be detonated. Santos had 30 seconds to reach the service tunnel before the Apex Center became a very expensive pile of rubble. As he crawled through the tunnel towards safety, Santos could hear the building collapsing behind him. Davidson's fortress, his headquarters, his monument to criminal achievement, all of it was turning to dust and debris. But more importantly, Santos had what he'd come for, evidence that would expose not just Davidson's crimes, but the entire network of corruption that had made them possible. The war was entering its final phase, and Santos Mueller held all the advantages. Davidson's empire was about to fall, and everyone who'd enabled his crimes would fall with him. The hunter had become the hunted, and now it was time for the reckoning. Chapter 8, Checkmate. The explosion at the Apex Center lit up the Colorado sky like a second sunrise, visible from 20 miles away. By the time fire departments arrived, Davidson's fortress was nothing but burning rubble and twisted metal. Local news reported it as a gas leak explosion, but Santos knew that by morning, Davidson would understand exactly what had happened. Chapter 9, Justice Served. The Denver Federal Building had never seen a morning quite like this one. By 7 a.m., the parking garage was filled with unmarked vehicles from agencies across the federal government. FBI, Treasury, Justice Department, and even CIA personnel streamed into the building carrying boxes of evidence and files of arrest warrants. Santos Mueller walked through the chaos with quiet satisfaction. After 6 weeks of playing the role of defeated federal agent, he was finally himself again, the relentless investigator who'd never met a case he couldn't crack or a criminal he couldn't bring down. Edwin Piper was the first arrest. Santos watched through a conference room window as his former mentor was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. 23 years of federal service, destroyed by greed and corruption. "He keeps asking to speak with you," said Darla Chase, the FBI agent coordinating the arrests. "Claims he can explain everything." "There's nothing to explain," Santos replied. "I found his files at Davidson's facility. He's been selling federal investigations to a criminal organization for at least 5 years. The evidence was overwhelming. Piper's collaboration with Davidson was documented in excruciating detail. Every case he'd compromised, every investigation he'd derailed, every federal agent he'd betrayed. The man Santos had trusted like a father had been working for the enemy from the beginning. The second wave of arrests was even more satisfying. Prosecutors, judges, and federal agents across 4 states were taken into custody as the scope of Davidson's network became clear. Each arrest was based on irrefutable evidence Santos had extracted from the Apex Center's computers before destroying the facility. But the prize remained elusive. Dwayne Davidson had vanished after the destruction of his headquarters, presumably fleeing to one of his international safe houses. Santos had anticipated this. Men like Davidson didn't survive by fighting to the last stand. They survived by having multiple escape routes and enough money to disappear when things went wrong. "We've frozen his domestic assets," Agent Chase reported, "but he probably has accounts in non-extradition countries. He could stay hidden indefinitely." Santos smiled. "No, he can't." "What do you mean?" Santos pulled out a file he'd been saving for this moment. Davidson made 2 mistakes. First, he assumed I was just a federal investigator who would follow normal procedures. Second, he underestimated how far I'd go to get justice for my wife. The file contained surveillance photos Herman's team had taken during their preparation phase. Images of Davidson's private retreat in the Cayman Islands, complete with architectural plans and security assessments. While you were processing arrests, I've been tracking Davidson's movements through his financial transactions. He's been moving money to his Cayman account for the past week, preparing for his escape. But the Caymans have an extradition treaty with the United States for major crimes like treason and murder. Agent Chase studied the photographs. "You're suggesting we request extradition?" "I'm suggesting we don't wait for extradition procedures." Santos opened his phone and showed Chase a message from Willie Herman. "Package delivered. Subject secured. Awaiting pickup instructions." "You had him kidnapped?" "I had him arrested by private contractors operating under the authority of the federal warrant you issued this morning. Davidson is currently being held at a secure location, ready for transport back to United States custody." It was a legal gray area that would probably generate controversy later, but Santos didn't care. Davidson had murdered his wife, terrorized innocent people, and corrupted the federal justice system. If capturing him required bending a few rules, so be it. 4 hours later, Dwayne Davidson was led into a Denver holding facility in shackles and an orange jumpsuit. The man who'd once commanded a private intelligence empire, who'd lived in luxury while ordering the deaths of federal agents, looked like what he truly was, a common criminal facing the consequences of his actions. Santos waited in the interrogation room when they brought Davidson in. The 2 men stared at each other across the metal table, predator and prey with their roles finally reversed. "You destroyed everything," Davidson said finally. "Decades of work, billions of dollars in assets, hundreds of operatives. For what? Your wife is still dead." "My wife is still dead," Santos agreed. "But she's been avenged. Your network is destroyed, your collaborators are in prison, and you're going to spend the rest of your life in federal custody. You think this is over? I had clients in 12 countries. Government officials who depended on my intelligence services. They won't just forget about the disruption you've caused." Santos leaned forward. "Let them come. I've already exposed your entire client list to the appropriate authorities. Every politician you were blackmailing, every foreign agent you were bribing, every intelligence officer you corrupted, they're all facing their own reckonings now." Davidson's confident facade finally cracked. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. I understand them perfectly. I've been dealing with criminals like you for 20 years. The only difference is that this time, it was personal." Santos stood to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Davidson? Rebecca May has agreed to testify against you in exchange for witness protection. She's going to tell the jury exactly how you order my wife's murder, exactly how you plan to kill me, exactly how you corrupted federal officials to protect your operation." For the first time since Santos had met him, Dwayne Davidson looked genuinely afraid. "She won't do it. I have leverage over her psychological conditioning that stopped working the moment she realized you'd been using her. Rebecca May is a lot smarter than you gave her credit for. smart enough to recognize when she's been manipulated by a sociopathic criminal. Santos left Davidson in the interrogation room and walked out of the federal building into the Colorado sunshine. His phone was buzzing with messages from superiors, colleagues, and reporters who'd gotten wind of the massive federal operation. But Santos ignored them all. He had one more stop to make. The cemetery where Lynette was buried overlooked the Denver skyline, a peaceful place where the noise and chaos of the city seemed distant. Santos knelt beside her headstone and placed a single red rose on the grass. "It's over," he said quietly. "Davidson's in custody. Everyone who helped him is either dead or in prison. Justice has been served." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Santos could almost imagine he heard Lynette's voice, telling him she was proud of him, telling him it was time to move forward with his life. Santos stood and walked back to his car, where Willie Herman was waiting. "What's next?" Herman asked. "Next, I testify at about 50 trials and make sure every one of these bastards gets convicted. Then I figure out what to do with the rest of my life." "Any ideas?" Santos looked back at the cemetery, then at the Denver skyline in the distance. Maybe private security. Maybe consulting with federal agencies on complex investigations. Maybe something completely different. He'd won his war against Davidson, but the victory had cost him everything he'd thought he wanted. His career as a federal agent was over. The methods he'd used to destroy Davidson's network were too controversial for him to continue in government service. His marriage to Lynette was a memory now, their future together stolen by a criminal's greed. But Santos Mueller had learned something about himself during these weeks of planning and fighting. He was capable of far more than he'd ever imagined. When everything he cared about was threatened, when the system he'd served failed to protect innocent people, he'd become something beyond a federal investigator. He'd become justice itself. As Santos drove away from the cemetery, he thought about Rebecca May, now in federal protection, preparing to testify against her former handlers. She'd chosen redemption when given the chance, proving that even people who'd done terrible things could change when offered hope. He thought about Davidson, sitting in a federal holding cell, contemplating a future that held nothing but concrete walls and iron bars. The man who'd thought himself untouchable had learned that some lines should never be crossed. And he thought about Lynette, whose death had unleashed a force that Davidson never could have anticipated, a man with nothing left to lose and everything needed to win. The woman in seat 14A was gone, but her memory had inspired a reckoning that would echo through the halls of power for years to come. Justice had been served, and Santos Mueller had kept his promise to the only woman he'd ever loved. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.